Now we're going to look at the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. This is the most important thing that we can learn about our faith. Paul said, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. 1 Corinthians 15:14. So this is crucial to our faith. If Christ hasn't really been raised, then our faith is pointless. And skeptics obviously don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, or they're at least very skeptical about it and inquiring, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? Side note, a skeptic is anyone who doubts or just questions our beliefs. Helpful to remember as we go through this series. So for this video, we're going to be looking at the first piece of evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, which is showing that he really did die. That's the first line of evidence. Jesus actually died. You can't rise from the dead if you didn't actually die. And so this will make more sense as we look through it. So we need to demonstrate what evidence shows that Jesus actually died. Let's look at the biblical record first. John 19:17 through 18, it says, "So they took Jesus, and carrying his own cross, he went out to the place called the place of the skull, called in Aramaic Golgotha. There they crucified him." And then in John 19:31 through 33, it says, "Then because it was the day of preparation, so that the bodies should not stay on the crosses on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders asked Pilate to have the victims' legs broken and the bodies taken down. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of two of the men who had been crucified with Jesus. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and blood and water flowed out immediately." Keep that in mind. We need to remember that. So because of the Bible and what the Gospels teach, we believe that Jesus first died, and then he rose from the dead. What do skeptics say? Well, some might say that Jesus never even died. He just appeared to die, and after that, he spent 3 days in the tomb and left the tomb and then convinced everybody that he rose from the dead when he never actually died. You see? So it's important to the case that Jesus rose, that he actually died first. So we need to be certain of this. The first 3 lines of evidence we could say to this point is Romans were professional executioners. Take into consideration that Roman soldiers were the ones who put Jesus to death, and it was their job to make sure that their victims were killed. If they didn't successfully kill their victims, then they would be killed. That was one of the punishments for Roman soldiers. So if you're tasked with killing somebody by crucifixion, you better make sure you get the job done, or else you would be killed. So we can be sure that Romans knew what they were doing when it came to crucifixion, and this is how the biblical record says that Jesus died. Point number 2 is Jesus was scourged before he went to the cross. When you read the Gospels, you see that word scourged, and in the footnotes it says to be scourged is whipped severely, and that the whip had bones and metal embedded into it. And so this was a severe punishment, and often the victims would die from being scourged. And Jesus was scourged, and the record shows that he survived the scourging and then was taken to be crucified. And that's point number 3. Jesus was crucified. This was the worst form of punishment that could happen, the worst form of execution probably that the world's ever seen. And the Romans were the ones who inflicted it. They designed it to cause the most pain over the longest time that eventually led to death. This is from the Net Bible, and it says, "Crucifixion was the cruelest form of punishment practiced by the Romans. Roman citizens could not normally undergo it. It was reserved for the worst criminals, like treason. The Roman historian Cicero called it a cruel and disgusting penalty. Josephus, who we learned about, called it the worst of deaths. So it was graphic. It was terrible. Nails were driven into the hands and feet of the victims, and they would hang there till they could no longer pull themselves up, because when they're down, they aren't breathing well, and they would die by asphyxiation. If the victim was taking too long, the soldiers would come around and break the legs of the victim so that they could no longer pull themselves up to breathe. In the report of Jesus' death, it says they saw Jesus was already dead. So they went around, they broke the legs of the two thieves on the cross. They saw that Jesus was already dead, but just to make sure, they grabbed a spear and thrust it into his side. And medical doctors know that when blood and water flow out, it means it deposited fluid to the lungs. And so it's known by medical doctors that this was due to heart failure. That's why water and blood flew out of Jesus's side when he was stabbed by the spear. So even if Jesus didn't die by asphyxiation, he would have died by the spear that was jammed into his side. Pretty compelling evidence. So here's ultimately why the theory that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross fails. Even if he survived the cross, would he really be able to survive 3 days in the tomb, bleeding out without some kind of medical attention? Would he have been able to unravel himself from the linen cloth that they typically wrapped around a corpse when they put him into the tomb? Would he have been able to move the stone by himself and fight off the guards and then convince the disciples that he rose from the dead? Again, without the medical attention. He had nails through his hands and feet. He was whipped over his entire body, and he had the spear in his side. Would he really be compelling enough to convince his disciples in the world that he didn't actually, or that he actually died and that he rose from the dead? No, they would know he was barely standing, and without a miracle, he never would have been able to do any of those things. But that's the point, is that skeptics deny that a miracle took place, and so they're trying to give some kind of natural explanation. But as we consider the evidence, it's so clear that there's no way Jesus could have survived the things that he did without some type of miracle. And of course, the Bible records that Jesus actually died, and it was for the purpose to rise him from the dead again and to save people and bring a people to himself by being raised from the dead. So for all these reasons and more, we know that Jesus actually died on the cross, a vital piece of evidence as we're going to make this ongoing case that Jesus really rose from the dead. In the next few videos, we'll look at other lines of evidence.